Hello. Well, what would you do if your spouse came home shattered from a traumatic experience and begged you not to call the police? That's the impossible situation facing Paul Nelms in my guest's debut novel. I'm in conversation with Buddy Howard, author of The Burden of Evidence, a psychological legal thriller that explores the gray areas where conscience meets consequence. Buddy, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I really appreciate the chance to be on here.
Well, now you've spent your career in financial analysis and mergers and acquisitions. So, what made you decide to write a legal thriller? Was this genre always calling to you?
The original idea for this novel happened in 1977 when I was in college. And I had an event happen to me that I can't really go into. It would be a spoiler. But I disclose that at the very end of the book. And I say, this was the genesis of the whole idea. And so I'm 67 now. So this occurred when I was roughly 20. So I've been kind of nursing this thing in the back of my head along in some ways for about 47 years.
Wow.
And I have always just thought in the back of my head, someday I need to write this book. And at 67, you get to a point in life where you just say, look, you need to go ahead and get on this if you're going to do it. And so I finally just said, this is the time. And probably the one thing that really affected me as much as anything is I was having dinner with some friends. And the lady said, you know what you need is a deadline. And she said, yours is July 4th. Well, I uploaded to Amazon on July 3rd. And so many times what we need is a deadline. And she gave it to me. And so to this day, she's in the acknowledgments. She and her husband's names are in the acknowledgments. And in the back of my head, I always think about Susan and how Susan gave me the deadline and how effective that was at getting me moving to work towards a goal that I'd had for many, many years.
And it's so true about a deadline because a lot of people don't operate daily on a deadline, but when you have one, things get done. So
Yeah,
kudos to
absolutely.
Susan.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Nancy.
Yeah. Was there a specific moment that sparked this career pivot into storytelling?
I've always been interested in writing, and I had on my bucket list publishing a novel and have had it on there for a long, long time. When I was listening to NPR and I heard a gang member interviewed, and this particular gang member was talking to the interviewer, and the interviewer said, "Did you ever think about just getting a job?" And he laughed and he said, "No, that was slow money." And I thought, slow money, I love that term. I love the mindset. And I started thinking about this gang member, and he was engaging. I mean, I sat there and listened to the guy, and I thought, this is a gang member. And yet he was so human. I mean, he was so, you could identify with him. And I started thinking about a young kid who starts thinking about slow money and fast money and how that affects life perspective and how that affects
Right.
where they decide to go and all that. And so I started writing a story about him. And his name was Levi. And so I wrote this, I don't know, 20,000 words. A typical novel is maybe 80 to 100,000. So I wrote probably the equivalent of maybe a fourth of a novel about Levi. And then later on started working on The Burden of Evidence and started nursing that along. And then at some point while I was working on Burden of Evidence, I went, oh, wow,
Mhm.
Levi needs to be in this. And so I brought him into The Burden of Evidence. And so that happens for me a lot of times. I'll be working on one thing and I'll say, what we need to do is this needs to be in here. This will really make this story great. And for some reason, and so that was one of those things where there was some truth, even though Burden of Evidence is fiction. There are characters in there which I've seen or who I've heard or glimpses of those characters I've put into these characters that are in the book.
Now, give us an idea of the book. Like, give us a little overview.
Paul Nelms is a 55-year-old writer, and he's married to a woman named Catherine. And she comes home one night shattered, absolutely devastated. And something has happened to her, and she gives Paul some of the facts, but not all of the facts. But what is very clear to him is that she has been assaulted, and she doesn't want to go to the police. And so he does what I would do, or what many other husbands would do, which is you sit there and you think about, what should I do? Should I take the matter into my own hands? And he starts to do that, and it backfires. And then he tries to extricate himself from this situation that arises when he tries to take the matter in his own hands. And the longer he tries to extricate himself, the more he realizes he can't. And the stakes continue to rise to the point that at the end of the book, he really has to make a decision. Do I do the right thing, or do I risk everything that I have come to love? And he doesn't make that decision until the very end of the book. And there's also a component of this book that's a who done it? Did
Right.
he do it, or did he do it? This
Okay.
is twisty. This is twisty. I mean, you will have stuff that you did not see coming. And that's what, if you read the reviews on this book, you're going to see that as a common theme. I did not see that coming. And I had somebody say, my jaw would like drop. And so in my mind, that's like one of the most flattering things somebody has told me, because if they were entertained to the point that they actually changed their facial expression while they were reading, they were in it.
8 years. That's how long you lived with these characters while writing the book. What's it like having Paul and Catherine Nelms and all these other people essentially living in your head for nearly a decade?
Oh, you love them. And you sit there and every now and then you kind of remind yourself they're just made up, and it's a little bit sad,
Yeah.
but it's funny. When I was writing the book, what would happen would be the story would be going along, and all of a sudden, Paul would do something stupid in my head. And I'd think, Paul, you knew better than to do that. But then I'd write it into the book and I'd go, how are you going to get yourself out of this? And I wouldn't know. But after a while, the story sort of wrote itself. And I like to think in my head in a crazy way. In some ways, these characters were writing their own story as we were going through it. But I love the characters, all but one. There's one character I really don't love, don't like, but all the other ones I like. And so that's been fun. And I've tried to imagine what they look like, and I've shown some renderings of versions of how I view them. And it's been interesting to hear people's reactions to, oh, that looks exactly like I pictured, or that doesn't look like who I thought it would be. But it's been fun just to go ahead and put an actual face with some of these characters.
What drew you to explore this tension between, I guess you would call it seeking justice and honoring someone's wishes?
Well, you know, I um, I always feel like I have to even be careful about talking about the uniquely difficult period, the uniquely difficult experience of being a woman who goes through what Catherine goes through. I can't experience that directly. I can imagine how incredibly difficult it must be to be weighing the need to disclose, for justice to be served, for other people to be protected, and yet not wanting to be in court a victim or re-victimized by people asking you questions about what led to that or whatever it is.
Right.
But I certainly understand how incredibly difficult that situation might be. And when I thought about struggles. And if you think about a novel, that's basically what you're talking about. You're talking about struggles. I just couldn't imagine anything worse than having someone you loved attacked and not being able to do anything about it. And so for me, that was the predicament Paul found himself. And that's a struggle that kind of goes through this novel is balancing that. And that's part of what makes Paul very human to me, because that's exactly how I would feel.
You know, your readers consistently mention your morally gray characters. How important was it to create protagonists who aren't simply heroes or villains? That's what we're generally used to, but you decided this wasn't going to work for you.
To me, a little bit of it is believability because ultimately the characters have got to be credible. And if you have somebody that's a superhero, it's just not real. I mean, I am much more interested in reading somebody who's got some flaws, who struggles with the decisions, who sometimes makes the bad decisions and maybe they correct them. And that to me is much more interesting than somebody who's at either extreme. And, I think it mirrors life. I think that everybody, you can take everybody, I'll point at myself. If you said, am I at this extreme or this extreme? I'm not at either one. I'm somewhere in the middle. And you could take bad person, great person, I'm somewhere in the middle. And every day I'm somewhere on that line, moving right or left, and I'm trying to always move toward the good side. These characters are no different.
Mhm.
And that's what makes them to me relatable. They're just like people and they have their flaws just like anybody else. But they have moments of greatness. And in this case, there's periods of greatness that are realized during this story.
You know, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned about truth having intrinsic energy. Can you expand on that and how it
Yeah.
plays into your storytelling?
There were a couple of themes and concepts that I had in this novel that I really liked, and that was one of them. And it was one of these things where there is in this story a truth that's not apparent to everyone, and yet there's this underlying pressure for it to be revealed. And it's almost as if no one did anything, there's almost a disclosure that it's almost creating in and of itself. Its existence, its very existence, kind of almost begs for being revealed at some point. Versus a lie, it doesn't really, it's not real, and so it doesn't have that intrinsic energy to it to be discovered. Somebody has to actively tell a lie for that to get spread. Versus if something's true, then its very existence is something that can be sort of discovered. I'm probably not explaining that very well, but
Oh, yeah.
anything that's true, I just think has almost a built-in energy to be discovered. And you don't have that if it's not true.
Right. You know, readers are praising your plot twists. How do you craft surprises that feel both shocking and inevitable?
I think in life, I've been blindsided many times. And I think that those periods have oftentimes been periods of growth for me. And so I really wanted that in this novel. I wanted twist partly because I think the twist and the unexpected turns make it interesting. I love roller coasters. Well,
You?
I do. I do. And I would rather write a novel that's a roller coaster
Right,
in some ways than I would, a Ferris wheel or
right.
a merry-go-round. And to me, I think the twists make it interesting, and the way that they would come about would be they would just hit me.
Right.
There's one in particular that's probably a third of the way into the novel, and all of a sudden one day I went, "Oh my gosh, this needs to happen.
Right.
My gosh, if this happens." You know what? Oh my. And it was like suddenly this brand new situation occurring that I'd never imagined. And I thought, that's awful. And yet that's great. From a book standpoint, it's great. It's terrible to the character, but it's great in terms of just being an entertaining twist that nobody saw coming. I remember sending I had a beta reader I sent this to,
Right.
and they read it, and in the margin they said bombshell exclamation point, and they gave it back to me afterwards. I loved that one word, bombshell.
Hmm.
For me, that was payback for the effort I'd put into it to put that section in there.
Other writers are curious. What is your process?
I do my best when I have a specific time and say 300 words. That's what you're responsible for doing today. It doesn't have to be polished. Just get it down. There's all kinds of time for polishing. Capture it. Just make progress. And it's one of those things where a little bit of progress on a consistent basis. You mentioned earlier I'm a financial guy, so
Yes.
I talk in terms of compound interest and things like that would bore people to death. But what's true about compound interest is the idea is that it's consistency that ends up paying off in the long run. So there are people who sit down for 12 hours and they write and then they don't write for another 2 months. For me, my process is if I can sit down and just say 30 minutes, write 200 words, 300 words, whatever it is, and usually I'll set a certain amount and say, you've got to make this much progress. I can make a lot of progress in that sort of a structure.
And do you write morning or evening?
Morning, absolutely, morning.
Silence or with background music?
Silence, but after coffee.
It must be after coffee.
Must be after
Yeah.
coffee.
When we were speaking earlier, and I love this, you said everyone has a story to tell. What's the most important message you want readers to take away from this book?
Thank you for asking that question. That's like, to me, if there's one takeaway from this, and I'm talking specifically to every reader or listener or viewer who's watching this, you've got a story. You do. I'm not saying that you have to write a book about it. You have a story, and it's an important story, and it's a valid story with tears, with laughters, with struggles, with triumphs. I just want to affirm that story. And if you tell that story, it doesn't mean it has to be in the form of a book. It could be something you journal. It could be something you write. It could be something you tell somebody. By writing that story down, that story's captured for a period that may last long beyond your years on this earth.
Mhm.
And that's valid. And your story's valid. And that's what I've started to realize. You could take the most marginalized person standing on a corner of a street begging for money. That person has a story, and it's a valid story. And in many cases, you would talk to this person and you'd go, that person was so much deeper than I realized. It's kind of like that gang member. That gang member that I
Yeah.
that I heard on NPR, there
Yeah.
was an element of that I thought, this guy's got a story. It wound up being in a novel.
That's amazing, isn't it? When you really think about that.
It is, and the thing that's even more amazing in some respects is so few people realize they have it. They have
Hmm.
that, or that they don't understand the validity of it, or the importance, or the power of it. But I've never met someone who didn't have a story, and it's important. Every one of them is important.
What do you want readers to take away from your book?
I think ultimately, I'd love for them to be entertained. I'd love for them to pick up a couple of lessons. You mentioned the truth has an intrinsic energy.
Yeah.
There's another theme that I have in there that I just like, and there's a section where I kind of build into this, but the main character is talking to the psychiatrist that he's seeing, and he's grieving. The main character is grieving, and he's commenting on to the psychiatrist, and he's saying, I hate this part. I hate going through this grieving process. And the psychiatrist says, Paul, you're not going to really believe me when I say this, but let me tell you this story. And he tells this story about a woman in Uganda who had a daughter who was assaulted, lost the daughter, ended up, the husband was beat up and was in the hospital. And this woman didn't have time to grieve. She was so busy working, trying to get enough money to support the husband and buy the medicine. And so she tells this person she's talking to, grief is a privilege. It's a privilege to grieve. And so the psychiatrist is telling Paul this story, and he says, Paul, this woman, it'll take her so much longer to recover from this loss because she's not grieving. But she understood that grieving is a privilege. So I think I always thought of grief as something that's awful to go through. And yet, I think when you look at people who've lost people in their lives and they go through this grieving process, that's a part of healing. I've not really thought about that until I was writing the book and put it in there. And so I hope that there are people that will read the book and pick up just little comments like that or little subtle messages like that and go, it kind of changes my perspective about that. And at the end, I also want them to like the characters. I mean, these are people that I, for the most part, really like. And I just simply want to introduce them to people.
Before we wrap up, what advice would you give to someone who's been sitting on a story idea, maybe feeling like it's too late to start? I think this is the perfect question for you.
Nancy, you know how I'm going to answer this. It is never too late. It is never too late. And, I think that the older we get, honestly, the more valuable our stories become. And I would say this for anybody, if there's any listener out there that's ever thought about writing, and I want to encourage that and affirm that if anybody is, but if they ever do, what I would encourage them to do is find a place on their computer where they can start a file and they put writing thoughts and they just start accumulating them. It's important to understand that it doesn't mean that you've got to write a book. Right. It just means you need to tell that story, and particularly to young people who may not know it.
What's the best way for readers to connect with you? You have a website, I understand, yes.
BuddyHoward.com. I've got a website, and that's probably the easiest thing. There's a place where you can email me a message. I would love to hear from people. The most fun about writing a novel for me has been the interactions with people. Talking about Paul, Catherine, Rebecca, Levi, all these people, talking about what they didn't expect, what they would have expected. To me, that has been just so much fun. So I would love to hear from anybody who is nice enough to leave me a note or write and say something. Thank you if you do that. I would love to hear from you.
Buddy Howard, congratulations on your debut novel. Thank you so much for this. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Nancy. This was great. Thank you so much for taking the time.
The Burden of Evidence by Buddy Howard is available now.